Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. So, Spencer, what comes to mind when you think of civics?
Schoolhouse Rocks. You know, like, I'm just a
Ooh.
boo. Is that even a melody? I don't really remember, but just a lot of the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, and that type of information. What about you?
Okay, before I even answer, why school? I know school, so I've never seen Schoolhouse Rock. Let me just put that out there because I didn't grow
You
up
got
here.
homework for tomorrow.
But I know a lot of people associate the show, the song with making a bill, right?
Yeah, it was
Or
a
how a
catchy
bill was
song.
made.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so all right, so
And there was a lot of videos, and not just civics, but they had a lot of, catchy little bops about just the mechanics of government. So that's what I think of when I think of civics instruction. What about you?
For me, I think government, right? So similarly, like, the branches of government or like how bills are made, who is the president kinds of thing, like those sort of things. So to me, it's a advanced level of social studies is how I see civics.
I like that.
But so in today's episode, what we're going to be talking about is there is this new book out there called Promoting K-12 Learning and Civic Engagement Through Assessments. And there was this blog that I came across called Assessing Civic Learning, where they interviewed the authors, Laura Hamilton, David Kidd, and Sam Raccoon about their book. And I thought it was interesting, the angle that they took or why they thought the book was needed or important. And so one of the things I want us to do today in this episode is kind of talk about what is civic learning and then what are some of the challenges that the authors thought was worthy to put into a book. Because I guess for them, civics is much more than what you and I just discussed. It's this sort of multicultural, global kind of perspective. And so given where we are today, I think it's necessary for us to kind of look at, what is civics learning and, how are we assessing it in our schools? So I'll pitch it to you because if I'm not mistaken, your background, unlike mine in math, is in social studies, correct?
Yeah, I taught middle school and high school social studies history for a number of years.
Wonderful. So I'll be leaning on you a lot for this episode. So given your background, how should we define civic learning?
So I like how the book frames it. So in the first chapter, they describe as a broad conceptualization of civic learning as the set of skills, knowledge, dispositions, and actions that contribute to effective engagement. So there's kind of a model of involves the head in terms of the knowledge, like the mechanics of government. This is the area where it's easy to measure. This is the kind of stuff that Schoolhouse Rocks can put together a great, little video for.
Right.
But if we stop there, that's a limited view of civics. They stress they also need to involve, say, the heart, like in terms of those dispositions. The book talks about, the civic virtues like tolerance for diverse viewpoints, empathy, sense of civic duty. And also, I think like the hands itself, the stuff that we do, the skills and actions, the ability to engage in civil discourse, to analyze media for bias, to participate in the community problem solving. And these, I think, like when you asked me, my answer was much more the head. And that's probably when I was in the classroom, the stuff that's easier to measure with the like selected response assessment method. But I like how the book also brings in the hearts and the hands as well.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think one of the things, so the book is all about how do we assess something that is more than just knowledge. And, when we have our course, we have our assessment literacy course, there's a section where we talk about these assessment methods, right? And when you look at the standard, right, certain methods, like you said, the multiple choice is really good for certain types of learning targets, like your knowledge. But when you have learning targets that are around, like you say, attitudes or dispositions or actions and skills, Like we need something else. And one of the things that the book really highly promotes is the use of, and I know you'll like this, performance-based
Yep.
tasks and assessments in civics. And so again, the main thing is we are really used to multiple choice, but they don't seem to capture, let's say, a student's ability to defend a viewpoint or to participate in community building or
Yeah.
community problem solving. And, examples of some of the performance tasks that they sort of highlighted, which I thought was interesting, is portfolios, for
Hmm.
example. So, what would it look like in our schools if we had students sort of curate evidence of citizenship, right? So, not just teaching them about what it is to be a citizen, but they're having these pieces where they're reflecting on evidence of being a good citizen or steward of government, like having a portfolio that captures all of that. And like you and I have discussed in the past, that reflection piece is so
Yeah.
important to having a portfolio.
Yeah. And I think performance assessments, part of the value is that they provide opportunities for authentic assessment. So
Yeah.
instead of, theorizing about something or just kind of regurgitating and recalling, it allows
Hmm.
students to actually do the thing, which I think applies quite nicely in terms of, that civic responsibilities that we might have. It also allows assessments to be more student driven, where
Yeah.
students are figuring out how they're going to show the thing and
Hmm.
transfer that knowledge, which I think is also important in terms of civics, so that it's not just the instructor saying, here is the exact way that you ought to participate in your community.
Yeah. Yeah. Another example that they gave that I thought was interesting for performance based assessment is a simulation. So, like having
Hmm.
a mock trial or a mock UN assessment event. And I thought that was like, yes, those are definitely plausible. And I think those also allow for some choice and voice that students can have when they're participating in these in a way that a multiple choice can't.
Yeah, you can get into that kind of transference of knowledge that,
Hmm.
like McTighe talks about in terms of one of the definitions of performance assessment by dropping them in one of these scenarios and see how they would respond.
Yeah. And then lastly, they talked about civic capstones. So
Yeah.
something like this long-term service project. And I mean, it can't be, oh, maybe let me not limit it. Because when I think long-term, like a year long or maybe a
Mhm.
semester long project, where students are proposing a problem and coming up with a solution. And so that reminded me of when we interviewed those students that for the GIS.
Yep.
Remember, they were coming up with this sort, again, like a simulation where they were coming up. What if you had this mock global mega city? You
Yeah.
know, what are some problems you foresee and how they can use that GIS computing to kind of solve some of those problems?
Yeah, or I think about, I remember reading recently about students that lived in a community where, in theory, they could bike to school, but there just
Yeah.
wasn't the infrastructure. So
Mm,
they kind of pitched the idea of like, oh, let's get more bike racks to make it easier for kids to kind of bring their bikes. But then
mhm,
they had to figure out how to navigate the system throughout the school system, but also the community system to get
uh-huh.
these like installed. And that allowed essentially moving from the theoretical, just singing a song about making change to actually figuring out how to implement it yourself.
And in that example, you can see that is civic learning, right? You're
Yes.
learning how to advocate for yourself. You're learning how to work within certain structures like local government, school board,
Yeah.
policy. Like to me, that is the essence of what civic learning is about. Like
Yeah.
taking all of the things and putting them into action for and then coming up with a solution for a problem that you see that would be beneficial for you.
Yeah. And the subject there, and that's the value of performance assessment, was the students themselves, as opposed to the teacher saying, this is what you ought to find important. This is what your
Hmm.
capstone is going to be. So
Hmm.
the student driven element of performance assessments, I think, is important for civic learning, but also this conversation is kind of microcosm for a lot of different skills that are tricky to assess. And so in many ways, it kind of lives alongside the four C's of creativity and collaboration, communication, and critical thinking.
Agreed. And one of the things when they talked about these kinds of assessments is tool that we have discussed in the past is using rubrics, right?
Yep.
So, you know, while these are tricky things to assess, this is another place where having a well crafted rubric can be used for grading assessments such as these.
Yeah. And this is an area where I might advocate for the use of a single point rubric as
Whoa.
compared to an analytic rubric. Analytic rubric, if you think the prototypical rubric, the big matrix, the grid with all those,
Yep.
and the teacher is describing expectations at each performance level for each criteria. And that's really
Mhm.
useful when you can do that. But when something is a little bit more student driven in terms of how they're going to show what they know, it might be a little tricky to fill out that entire grid. So
Yeah.
single point rubric, and we can drop resources in the show notes. You have the criterion in the middle, but then it's descriptive feedback for how students exemplified it. So I think that can be a little bit more open to students showing how they develop these skills in a way that perhaps a teacher wonderfully wasn't able to predict ahead of time.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That is a task specific kind of rubric where again you can define what is the expectation, and then there's areas for here's where you've met the expectations, and here are areas where you need to improve. I think that's a great idea. In addition to using rubrics or even performance based assessments, there are some possible challenges with this approach. Would you like to elaborate on one of them that they mentioned in the book?
Yeah, one of the things that they stress is that it can be tricky when it comes to the reliability and validity of assessments.
Hmm.
And this, I think, is true for a lot of these kind of broad performance assessments. As a reminder, so reliability is essentially whether an assessment is consistently reporting something.
Yep.
So a scale example, we interviewed a while back Dr. Gregory Civic, and he used this example that I like. A scale is a reliable assessment if it's giving you roughly the same number each time you stand on it. Now, it's going to fluctuate based on your life and things like that, but
Hmm.
it being consistently kind of giving the idea. So, like, if you give the same test to the same kid under the same conditions, kind of multiple days, you would expect, roughly speaking, the same results. If so, then the assessment is reliable. But we also want an assessment to be valid, that it's measuring what it's supposed to be doing. If every time I step on the scale, it's telling me like 65, 65, 65, well, that's a reliable assessment, but it's not necessarily a valid one. Maybe it's actually
Right.
pulling like my heart rate instead or something like that. So we want it to not just be consistent, but consistently right. And anytime you have these kind of like big performance assessments, like a capstone where a kid's going out in their community, all those kind of things there is some concern, or I should say, it takes a lot of work in terms of the criteria that you're setting and the rubric
Hmm.
that you're creating and how you're using that rubric to make sure that it's reliably giving the same kind of feedback and it's valid in terms of it's measuring the stuff that we actually are trying to measure and not something else. So I think that can be, I think challenge is the right word because it's not a roadblock. It's not a reason why we shouldn't do these things, but you have to work really hard at that rubric and how you're using the rubric to make sure that this as an assessment is giving you reliable and valid information.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things that you talked about is sometimes when people think of performance tasks, since they don't see it as a traditional standardized assessment,
Yeah.
and we tend sometimes in education to think anything that is not a standardized test
Mm,
is not worth paying attention to. And so I liked how these authors were trying to lift up. No, standardized assessments are great, but they can't be used for everything. And
yeah.
so there are other ways that we can measure
Hmm.
and still get really reliable and valid data.
Yeah. And part of it comes down to just wondering just who gets to set the criterion. And that's where
Ooh.
questions of bias can kind of seep in terms of like me imposing on students how they should engage in their community. And this is where we can kind of refer to some of the resources that we get from, say, NCDPI, like the new civics course that's been kind of rolling out for high school. So we can pull some language there to make sure that the criterion are well-founded and useful and can serve as the backbone for a strong rubric that's going to yield some reliable and valid information.
Agreed. So another challenge that the authors talked about was in terms of making sure that there's equitable access. That
Yeah.
sometimes when we use an approach by going to performance-based assessments, especially at the high school level, there is a tendency that these types of assessments only show up in certain classes, right?
Mm,
In your advanced classes or your IB classes or your AP classes. And as a result, only certain students are having access to that kind of thinking and
yeah.
then being assessed that way. And so being mindful that in any time that we're teaching around civics learning, what are some opportunities that we can give all students? Because it's not really about the students being able to demonstrate, but can the assessment, and if we set up the assessment right, the assessment is a good measure of the type of learning that we are measuring.
Yeah. Not just even equitable access to courses that stress these things, but within
Mhm.
the courses, if you're using some of these authentic learning experiences, make sure there's equitable access to show what you know. So, for instance, going and advocating at the town hall for something for your community is great, but are we making sure that there is equitable access for kids to actually do so? And that's
Right.
where, like the blog post, I like how there's a paragraph that I'll share here that I thought was important. They say looking at outcomes in isolation, studying students' civic knowledge or skills, for example, doesn't explain why performance might differ across areas, nor does it help us understand if schools are providing meaningful opportunities for civic development. Adding systematic, well designed measures of learning opportunities, i.e.,
Yeah.
student resources, experiences, instructional quality, school climate, and even community context provides a clearer picture that we can use to assess whether schools are taking effective steps to build civics related competencies. So I like the idea of not just measuring learning outcomes, but also measuring learning opportunities so that the two can
Yes.
inform each other.
You know, that made me think as if I'm in a school, how can I measure some of those learning opportunities?
Mm,
And a selfish plug, like I wonder whether our student survey could be a
yeah.
place to find out or use that data to figure out, are our students getting those learning opportunities? Like what are our students saying about those kinds of learning opportunities? So in addition to also having a different kind or thinking of assessment, collecting the data to figure out if we're doing it right
Hmm.
requires us to also look at some other data that we have, not just outcome data, like how are students performing, but I mean, looking at some of our perspective data. So what are our students saying about what we are providing them as well might be helpful.
Yeah, and this goes back to our previous episodes on street data, checking
Yeah.
with students to get a sense of just what assets they bring and what life
Mhm.
is like for them. And I think that can help illuminate, what opportunities they have. And it might also allow us to find other ways to have them authentically engage with some of these civics standards.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this episode, what was one takeaway that you had from the article?
For me, it was just that just because something is difficult to measure doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do so. Um,
Ooh.
and in fact, in an era of unparalleled computing power, the employable skills are the very ones that are the hardest to measure, the ones that
Mhm.
require something like performance assessment to get at this kind of deeper learning. And connected here, just to not confuse assessment with grading. You can provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their skills with an area without trying to figure out how to precisely label it. So that, yeah, civics, along with, say, the four C's, can be tricky to measure, but that's the very reason why we should be making sure that students have opportunities to show their development in those areas and receive some rich feedback from us. Yeah. What about you?
So for me, the one thing I took away is that there is always an opportunity to re-examine your approach.
Mm,
Like, what I'm sure most teachers who teach civics, they have the way that they teach their classes and and all of their curriculum already has all of these built-in assessments. But what I took away from this is there's always, as as we learn and grow and know more, there's always an opportunity for reflection and change. Like reflection and change, we ask our students to do that, but I thought that this was an exciting way for us as educators to reflect and change about, for a topic like civics, is this an opportunity for us to re-examine our curriculum and to look and see, do we have ways to measure all of the outcomes, not just certain outcomes, like to go back to that metaphor that you had, not just measuring the head because it's easy and it's quick. It's what we've always done. But, looking at the heart and the hand. And so re-examining our curriculum and seeing, are there measures to do those as well? Or do we just stick with the one because that's what we've always done? To me, this was an eye-opening experience to be like, it is good as educators to re-examine what we're doing. When we know better, we do better.
Yeah, and I think we can take a broad view of that we that's doing that re-examining, because one of the neat things as I was reading this is these questions that a history teacher might ask in terms of how to effectively measure these civic skills are not so dissimilar to the questions that, say, a math teacher is asking about how to effectively measure, say, the standards for mathematical practice. Yes. Or that maybe an art teacher is trying to figure out how to measure a student's skills in terms of, brush strokes or something like this. A lot of these like really overarching skills, we can come together, and it might be that some creative solutions exist in certain pockets of the school that we weren't expecting. So provide opportunities for teachers to collaborate and communicate together on these.
Oh, well said. Well said. So thank you, Spencer, for this episode. Any of the resources or points that we have, you can find in our show notes. The theme music, we want to thank Tremont Ponton from Millbrook High School. If you need to reach us, you can do so via our website, or you can email us at datalit@wcpss.net. And until next time, bye.
Take care.